Chapter 46, Poisoned Down, Corpse Destruction Powder. When Xu Qing heard this, his eyes abruptly widened. As his breathing hastened, he felt a rumbling in his mind. To be able to enter the tent and listen to the lecture was something he dreamed of. At that moment, in his excitement, he took a deep breath and bowed deeply toward the tent. "Thank you, grandmother." Xu Qing said these words very seriously. After a long time, he stood up and left the tent. On this day, he didn't see Grandmother Bai when he turned his head, but he heard Grandmother Bai criticizing the young man and woman in the tent. Xu Qing didn't bother about these. He was already overwhelmed by intense excitement. When he returned to his residence, he immediately informed Captain Lei of this matter. Captain Lei was also very surprised, especially when he saw Xu Qing's happy expression. His smile grew even wider and he felt rueful in his heart. Although he didn't tell him the reason why this kid frequently headed to the Forbidden Zone during this period of time, he knew that the other party was searching for the Heaven Fate flower that could extend his life. How could he not cherish such a loyal child who had saved his life in this cold world? However, he couldn't bear to see Xu Qing exhausted every time he returned. At that moment, seeing that Xu Qing was happy, Captain Lei was also very happy. Hence, on that day, Captain Lei cooked a rather sumptuous dinner for Xu Qing. During this time, he kept reminding Xu Qing to respect his teachers, respect Grandmother Bai, and so on. Xu Qing seriously memorized everything. Even after Xu Qing finished eating and returned to his room, he was still in a state of excitement. He was excited at the thought that he could attend the lesson in the tent tomorrow. While Xu Qing was filled with anticipation, he also found it hard to sleep. As he was worried about personal gains and losses, he suddenly thought of the first time he and the other children met the teacher in the slums. Hence, he opened the leather bag and tidied it up. In the end, he took out a relatively new bag and placed half of his spirit coins inside. There were also many of his white pills. From Xu Qing's understanding, knowledge was priceless. It wasn't a big deal for him to give away all his savings. However, he had to consider Captain Lei's sigh, so he left half of it behind. After doing all this, he let out a long sigh of relief and silently closed his eyes. He then began to cultivate and cultivate, waiting for dawn. This night was a long one for Xu Qing. When the sun rose into the sky, Xu Qing changed into a new set of clothes and washed his hands clean before walking out of the room. Just as he was about to leave, he was stopped by Captain Lei, who hadn't woken up early during this period of time. While giving Xu Qing detailed instructions, Xu Qing nodded patiently and listened attentively. In the end, Captain Lei helped Xu Qing tidy his clothes and passed him a leather bag. "You can't enter the tent empty-handed for a lesson." "I won't," Xu Qing said softly. Captain Lei glared, but he saw the determination in Xu Qing's eyes. Hence, he kept the leather bag and returned to his room to take out a flask of wine. "I know Grandmother Bai, he likes to drink. Bring this with you." This time around, Xu Qing didn't refuse. After receiving the flask, he left the courtyard. After taking a few steps, he turned his head and waved at Captain Lei, who was standing there. He then sprinted a few steps and headed straight for Grandmother Bai's tent. Looking at Xu Qing's back view, Captain Lei smiled. This kid wasn't this happy when we were distributing the 7-leaf grass. Mixed with happiness and nervousness, Xu Qing arrived at the place where he had been standing outside of for the past month. He then took a deep breath and knocked on the tent's door. "Coming." Upon hearing Grandmother Bai's voice, Xu Qing lowered his head and checked his clothes. He then tugged at his clothes forcefully to make them look tidier before he slowly pushed the door open. He then saw Grandmother Bai and the youth sitting inside the tent with the guards. When Xu Qing looked at them, they were also looking at him. Compared to Grandmother Bai's calm expression, the expressions of the youth and the young girl were much richer. Among them, the youth named Chen Feiyuan had an unconvinced expression, while the young girl, Ting Yu, was more curious. Xu Qing retracted his gaze and bowed deeply to Grandmother Bai. After that, he took out the leather pouch and alcohol flask he had prepared earlier. He then imitated what he did in the slums and handed them over with both hands. Xu Qing, who didn't lift his head, didn't see Grandmother Bai at that moment. However, there was a hint of gentleness in his calm gaze. Grandmother Bai didn't take the leather pouch. He only took the flask of wine and drank a mouthful in front of Xu Qing, as though it was some sort of ritual. "Class has begun," After putting down the flask, Grandmother Bai slowly spoke. It was still the first round of assessment. Tingyu and Chen Feiyuan seemed to be on par with Xu Qing. It was obvious that they had done their homework last night and their answers were very straightforward. After answering, they immediately looked at Xu Qing. Xu Qing didn't look at them. Instead, he looked at Grandmother Bai and answered all of his questions one by one. After that, Grandmother Bai nodded and started the lesson formal. Xu Qing listened attentively. He cherished the opportunity to enter the tent very much and wasn't distracted at all during the entire process. It was the same for Chen Feiyuan and Tingyu. This made Grandmother Bai feel a little amused. Just like this, another 10 days passed. Xu Qing was used to the lessons in the tent. However, his seriousness didn't reduce in the slightest and the knowledge he gained became increasingly abundant. However, compared to him, Chen Feiyuan returned to his old self in just a few days. Only Tingyu was still comparing herself to Xu Qing. She was extremely serious. However, after class, the two of them chatted a little more. Most of the time, it was Tingyu asking about life on the campsite out of curiosity. Xu Qing didn't speak much and only gave a few simple answers. As for Chen Feiyuan, from the start to the end, he wasn't convinced by Xu Qing and didn't say much. Xu Qing didn't mind this. He wasn't good at socializing to begin with, so he would leave for the Forbidden Zone as soon as possible after class. The reason why he went to the Forbidden Zone every day was because of the herbs. Before he understood about herbs, all the flowers and trees in the Forbidden Zone were no different to him. However, things were different now. Xu Qing would often discover some medicinal herbs that he knew of. Every time he discovered something like this, his understanding of plants and vegetation would deepen by quite a bit. However, Xu Qing also slowly discovered that the majority of the herbs in the Forbidden Zone were evil yin poisonous herbs. There weren't many medicinal yan herbs. Hence, his research on medicinal herbs focused on poison from the start. As he picked the poisonous grass, he also built a simple house in the small canyon and used it as a lab for studying poisonous grass. And with his body that could neutralize poison, Xu Qing was very bold in his research on poisonous grass. After trying out various combinations, he finally concocted an unknown venom. This venom was mixed with 8 types of poisonous grass and added with snake venom, using these 9 substances to concoct it. The poison contained intense corrosion. Xu Qing had tried it before. A single drop of the poison would cause the mutated beast's corpse to turn into blood within 5 breaths. However, it would only be so fast for corpses. For living creatures, for some reason, the time would increase by a lot. Even so, Xu Qing was already very satisfied with the first poison he concocted in his life. After he dried it into powder, he named it Corpse Destruction Powder. As for the yan medicinal herbs, although there were very few of them, Xu Qing still managed to concoct some semi-finished medicinal liquids with the help of the yin-yan extreme art. A small portion of it was mixed with the 7-leaf grass and it had some effects of suppressing anomalous substances. Xu Qing had once asked Grandmother Bai if he could cooperate on the prescription so it would have a better effect on Captain Lei. Grandmother Bai told him that other than the Heaven Fade flower, everything else was useless. As for his prescription, it would eventually lose its effectiveness. That was indeed the case. Even though Captain Lei took his medicine on time, every day, the weakness in his body could still be seen by the naked eye. When Xu Qing saw this, he fell silent. On this day, when the two of them were eating, Captain Lei wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, he still told Xu Qing that he felt that it was unsuitable for him to continue staying at the scavenger campsite. He was prepared to buy residency rights in the nearby city in the near future. Kid, I know that your path will definitely not stop at this small campsite. Your future will be even further, so I'd want to ask you to retire with me. The instant he heard this, Xu Qing, who was eating, paused. After a long while, he lowered his head and fell silent for a very long time before asking softly, "Are you coming back?" "Of course, I'll come back occasionally." Captain Lei smiled and raised his hand. This was the first time he touched Xu Qing's head. He sighed with emotion in his heart. He didn't want Xu Qing to risk his life in the jungle of the Forbidden Zone for him again. Xu Qing instinctively wanted to avoid it, but he glanced at Captain Lei and didn't move. This allowed Captain Lei's hand to land on his head smoothly. As he gently stroked it, Captain Lei laughed. "Besides, you can come and visit me anytime. When Xu Qing heard this, he nodded heavily. That night, Xu Qing opened his eyes many times during his cultivation and looked toward Captain Lei's room. This emotion was only buried in the depths of Xu Qing's heart after a few days. Every day, other than attending lessons at Grandmother Bei's place, he spent more time in the Forbidden Zone, trying his best to find the Heaven Fate flower. However, as Grandmother Bei had said, this flower could only be chanced upon by luck,